He didn't want any trouble. He just wanted to sit quietly by the memorial like he had every day for 3 years. But the young Marine in dress blues had other ideas. "Sir, you can't sleep here," the Marine said, pointing to the bedroll beside the bench. "This is a place of honor." The old man didn't argue. He just stood slowly and pointed to a name on the wall. "You see that one there?" he asked. "Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, KIA 1971? The Marine nodded. "I was supposed to bring him home," the old man whispered. "I'm still trying." Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of loss, loyalty, and recognition, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today? And if you believe stories like this need to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who never stopped carrying their brothers. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. wasn't supposed to be his home, but for Thomas "Tommy" Brennan, it had become the only place that made sense. Every morning at sunrise, he'd unfold his sleeping bag from the bench 50 yards away and walk slowly to the wall. His routine never changed. Black coffee from the Smithsonian vendor cart, a stale donut he couldn't really afford, and then 3 hours sitting in silence before the school groups and tourists arrived. He wore the same clothes every day, a faded olive drab field jacket with patches sewn over holes, combat boots held together with duct tape, and a Washington Nationals baseball cap so worn you couldn't make out the curly W anymore. To the tourists snapping selfies, he was invisible. To the joggers running the National Mall, he was an obstacle. To the park police, he was a problem they'd grown tired of solving. But Tommy wasn't homeless by accident. He was homeless by choice. Because every morning when he sat on that bench and stared at panel 10W, line 117, he could almost hear Rodriguez cracking jokes in that thick Bronx accent, could almost smell the jungle and hear that boombox playing salsa music, could almost feel the weight of a promise he'd carried for 52 years. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, age 19, KIA March 15, 1971, Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam. The name was etched in black granite, but it was burned into Tommy's memory like a brand. Corporal Jimmy Mitchell from Camp Pendleton had been assigned to the Honor Guard detail at Arlington National Cemetery for 8 months. Today was supposed to be straightforward, a ceremonial visit to the Vietnam Memorial with a group of wounded warriors from Walter Reed Medical Center. Check the perimeter, ensure respectful silence, and escort the group through their remembrance ceremony. But the homeless guy on the bench was throwing a wrench in the works. Mitchell had seen him before during previous visits. Always the same spot, always the same 1,000-yard stare. Usually, the park police handled situations like this, but today they were stretched thin with some big-shot senator's visit. The wounded warriors would arrive in 20 minutes, and protocol demanded a clean, respectful environment. Mitchell approached slowly, his dress blue uniform crisp in the muggy D.C. morning. He'd dealt with homeless vets before. Guys who'd lost their way after Iraq, Afghanistan. Guys who'd never quite made it back from whatever sandbox had broken them. He tried to be respectful, but duty was duty. "Sir," he said, stopping a few feet from the bench, "I'm going to need you to move along. We got a ceremony starting in a bit." The old man didn't look up, didn't acknowledge him at all. Just kept staring at the wall like he was reading something written in a language only he understood. Mitchell tried again, a little louder. "Sir, you can't be sleeping here. This is a place of honor." That's when the old man finally moved. Slowly, like his bones were held together with spit and regret, he stood up. He was taller than Mitchell had expected, broader in the shoulders despite the way his jacket hung loose on his frame. And when he turned to face the Marine, his eyes weren't vacant or strung out like Mitchell had expected. They were sharp, alert, and filled with a kind of pain that made Mitchell take an involuntary step back. "You see that one there?" the old man asked, pointing with a finger that trembled slightly. "Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, KIA 1971. Mitchell followed his gaze to the wall. Panel 10W was packed with names, 58 of them, each representing a kid who never made it back to their hometown. A family destroyed, a future that got cut short in some God-forsaken jungle. But somehow, among all those names, his eyes found Rodriguez immediately. Like the old man's finger was a magnet pulling him to that specific spot. "Yes, sir," Mitchell replied, though he wasn't sure why he'd suddenly started using sir with a homeless guy. "I was supposed to bring him home," the old man whispered, and his voice carried the weight of decades. "I'm still trying." The words hit Mitchell like a gut punch. In 8 months of honor guard duty, he'd met families, survivors, brothers in arms of the fallen. But he'd never met someone who carried guilt like this, raw, unprocessed, eating away at him from the inside like acid. Did you serve with him?" Mitchell asked, his tone completely different now. The old man didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out something Mitchell hadn't expected to see. A challenge coin. Not new, not polished, but real. The kind that wasn't sold at the PX or earned in some ROTC program. The kind that came with blood and brotherhood and sleepless nights. "March 15th, 1971, the old man said. "Firebase Alpha, about 12 clicks northwest of Quang Tri. We were supposed to extract at 0800. Simple in and out, they told us. Recon mission. Gather intel and get out." Mitchell found himself leaning in, his ceremony completely forgotten. But Charlie had other plans. Tommy's voice grew steadier as he talked, like he was finally letting pressure out of a cooker that had been building steam for half a century. "Rodriguez was our RTO, radio operator. Kid from the South Bronx. Always talking about the Yankees, always had a picture of his girl Carmen taped inside his helmet. Smartest kid in the squad, smarter than any of us had a right to be in that hellhole." Mitchell stood perfectly still, his dress blues forgotten, his ceremony abandoned. Around them, the memorial began to fill with early morning visitors. Mostly older folks who came before the crowds, before the noise, before the world reminded them that most people had moved on. The mission went sideways about 2 hours in. We'd been watching a supply route, counting trucks, mapping positions, standard recon stuff. But when we called for extraction, the LZ was hotter than a pistol. Machine gun nest they hadn't bothered to mention in the briefing. Charlie had been watching us watch them. Tommy's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, pressing against something hidden beneath his jacket. Our pilot took fire on the first pass, couldn't set down. Rodriguez got on the horn, calling for alternate extraction points, trying to coordinate with air support. Kid was cool as a cucumber under fire, I'll give him that. Cooler than the rest of us old-timers. The old man paused, staring at the name on the wall like he was trying to will it to move, to change, to not be carved in stone forever. But then the mortars started walking in. The jungle erupted around them like the 4th of July and New Year's Eve rolled into one nightmare. Tommy, then Sergeant Thomas Brennan, 1st Cavalry Division, had been in country for 11 months. He'd seen combat, seen buddies die, seen things that would follow him home and camp out in his dreams for the rest of his life. But Firebase Alpha was different. Firebase Alpha was personal. "Rodriguez was maybe 20 feet from me when the first mortar hit," Tommy continued, his voice getting quieter. "Threw him against a tree like a rag doll, knocked his radio to smithereens. I could see he was hurt bad, blood coming from his head, left arm hanging wrong, but he was still conscious. Still trying to raise somebody on a radio that was nothing but twisted metal and broken dreams." Mitchell found himself holding his breath. "The LZ was compromised, but there was a clearing about half a click north. We could make it if we humped fast and kept our heads down." But Rodriguez couldn't walk. Shrapnel in both legs, possible spinal. I had to make the call. "What call?" Mitchell asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "I told the rest of the squad to die Mao to the alternate LZ. Told them I'd carry Rodriguez. Told them we'd be right behind them." Tommy's hand was shaking now, pressing harder against his chest. "But I was lying through my teeth." Chapter 6. The Weight of a Promise. The truth came spilling out like blood from a wound that had never properly healed. Rodriguez was unconscious by the time I got to him. Too much blood, too much damage. I knew he wasn't going to make it to any LZ. But I'd promised his mom in a letter I'd never had the guts to send that I'd bring her boy home. I'd promised Carmen in my head. Every time I saw him looking at her picture and grinning like an idiot. Tommy pulled his hand away from his chest, and Mitchell saw what he'd been pressing. Dog tags, not his own. Tags that belonged to someone who'd been dead for 52 years. So I stayed with him. Held him while the mortars kept falling like rain.
Talked to him about the Yankees, about Carmen, about that apartment in Queens he was going to get when he rotated back to the world. I stayed until the slicks came for the rest of the squad. I stayed until the jungle went quiet. I stayed until...
He couldn't finish the sentence.
The body recovery team found us 3 days later. Me half dead from blood loss and dehydration. Rodriguez was gone. They said I was a hero for trying to save him. They said I did everything humanly possible.
Tommy looked directly at Mitchell for the first time, and the Marine saw something in those eyes that made him understand why this man couldn't live under a roof, couldn't sleep in a bed, couldn't pretend that normal life was an option.
But they were wrong. I didn't try to save him. I let him die, so I wouldn't have to face his family empty-handed. I let him die because I was a coward.
Mitchell had been trained to handle crisis situations, to de-escalate conflicts, to maintain order and protocol. But nothing in his military education had prepared him for this moment, standing face to face with a man who had been carrying a dead friend's guilt for half a century. "Sir," Mitchell said carefully, "I think you might be."
"I'm not wrong." Tommy cut him off. "I was there. I made the choice. I could have tried to carry him. Could have at least tried to get him to the LZ. Instead, I took the easy way out. The easy way out."
Mitchell couldn't keep the disbelief out of his voice.
"You stayed with him while mortars were falling. You nearly died trying to—"
"I stayed because I was scared," Tommy interrupted again. "Scared to face his family with his body? Scared to tell them I couldn't save their boy? So I let him die alone in that jungle, and I've been trying to make it right ever since." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Mitchell turned to see 3 black Suburbans pulling up to the memorial's parking area. The wounded warriors from Walter Reed. The ceremony, his duty. But when he turned back to tell the old man he'd have to leave, Tommy was already gathering his bedroll, already preparing to disappear into the city like he did every day when the crowds arrived. "Wait!" Mitchell called out. "Sir, wait!" Tommy stopped but didn't turn around. "What's your name?" A long pause. Then, quietly, "Sergeant Thomas Brennan, 1st Cavalry Division, Combat Medic." And suddenly, everything Mitchell thought he understood about the situation got turned upside down. Mitchell stood frozen as the pieces fell into place like dominoes. Medic, 1st Cav, Vietnam. The challenge coin, the dog tags, the way Tommy had described Rodriguez's injuries with clinical precision, the way he'd talked about staying with a wounded soldier under fire. This wasn't some homeless guy spinning war stories for spare change. This was a combat medic who had never forgiven himself for being human. "Sergeant Brennan," Mitchell called out, and this time his voice carried the respect of one Marine addressing a brother. "Permission to ask you something?" Tommy turned around slowly, surprised by the formal military courtesy. "If Rodriguez had made it, if you'd somehow gotten him to that LZ, what would you have told him about staying behind?" The question caught Tommy off guard. What do you mean?" "I mean, if your buddy had survived and he asked you why you stayed with him instead of saving yourself, what would you have told him?" Tommy stared at the young Marine, confusion replacing the resignation in his eyes. I would have told him that's what brothers do. That you don't leave a man behind. That some promises matter more than your own hide." Mitchell nodded slowly. "And if he'd asked you if staying with him was the right call, even if it meant you both might not make it out?" "Of course it was the right call," Tommy said without hesitation. "You don't abandon your brothers. Not ever. That ain't how we do things." "Then why," Mitchell asked quietly, "are you beating yourself up for making the right call?" The delegation from Walter Reed was approaching the memorial. 12 wounded warriors in wheelchairs and on crutches, accompanied by family members and honor guard escorts. Mitchell should have been with them, guiding them through their visit, maintaining protocol and dignity. Instead, he was standing with a homeless veteran who had just turned. "Sergeant Brennan," Mitchell said formally. "I'd like to invite you to join our ceremony today." Tommy shook his head immediately. "I can't. I don't belong with them. They're heroes. You're a combat medic who stayed with a dying soldier under enemy fire," Mitchell interrupted. "You're a man who has honored his buddy's memory every single day for 52 years. You're exactly who belongs at this ceremony." The wounded warriors were gathering near the wall now, some reading names, others placing small American flags at the base of the memorial. Mitchell could see his commanding officer looking around, probably wondering where his missing honor guard had wandered off to. "Sir," Mitchell said, "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez has been waiting 52 years for someone to tell his story. Today, you could tell it. Not the version where you failed him, but the real version. The one where a medic stayed with his brother and made sure he didn't die alone in some godforsaken jungle." Tommy looked at the wall, at Rodriguez's name, at the gathering of veterans and families who had come to remember. "I don't know how," he whispered. "Then let me help you," Mitchell replied. "Let us help you." Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, commander of the Honor Guard unit, was not pleased when Corporal Mitchell approached with what appeared to be a homeless man in tow. Her expression clearly said that whatever explanation Mitchell had better be outstanding. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, snapping a crisp salute, "I'd like you to meet Sergeant Thomas Brennan, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam." He was a combat medic who served with one of the soldiers honored on this wall. Colonel Martinez's expression shifted from irritation to professional curiosity. She'd been in the Corps long enough to recognize the look in Tommy's eyes, the particular weight carried by those who had seen the elephant and lived to tell about it. "Sergeant Brennan," she said formally, extending her hand. "Semper Fi, brother. Thank you for your service." Tommy stared at her outstretched hand like he'd forgotten how to shake hands with someone who wasn't trying to move him along or cite him for vagrancy. "Ma'am, I don't think I ought to be here," he said. "Why the hell not?" Colonel Martinez asked bluntly. She was career military, not given to diplomatic language. Tommy gestured toward the wounded warriors gathering near the wall. "These are real heroes, men who gave pieces of themselves for their country. I'm just some guy who couldn't save his buddy." Colonel Martinez studied him for a moment, then looked at Mitchell. "Corporal, would you please gather the delegation? I think Sergeant Brennan has a story these warriors need to hear." Within minutes, 12 wounded veterans had gathered in a loose circle near panel 10W. Some were recent casualties from Iraq and Afghanistan, kids who'd lost limbs to IEDs, who'd taken shrapnel in places that would hurt for the rest of their lives. Others were older veterans from different conflicts, guys who understood that war never really ends, it just changes addresses. What they all shared was an understanding of loss, of sacrifice, of the weight that comes with wearing the uniform and meaning it. Tommy stood awkwardly in the center, still clutching his bedroll, still looking like he was ready to bug out at the first opportunity. But Colonel Martinez wasn't giving him that option. "Sergeant Brennan," she said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "would you please tell us about Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez?" The name seemed to echo off the memorial wall. Tommy looked up at panel 10W, at the name he'd been staring at for 3 years, and for the first time he saw it differently, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. "Rodriguez was—" Tommy started, then stopped. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Louder, Sergeant," Colonel Martinez said, not unkindly. "These men have earned the right to hear his story." Tommy cleared his throat and tried again. "Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez was my RTO in Vietnam. Kid from the South Bronx, 19 years old, engaged to a girl named Carmen who sent him letters every single week." One of the wounded warriors, a young soldier missing his left leg, leaned forward. "What was he like, Sergeant?" "He was." Tommy paused, and for the first time in decades he smiled slightly. He was always running his mouth about baseball. Kid lived and breathed the Yankees. Used to say he was going to take Carmen to the World Series when he got back to the world. Had it all planned out. Good seats, hot dogs, Cracker Jacks, the whole 9 yards. The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. He never got that chance. With 12 sets of eyes watching him, 12 pairs of ears hanging on every word, Tommy began to tell the story he'd never told anyone, not the version he'd been telling himself for 52 years, full of guilt and self-recrimination, but the true version, the one that honored Rodriguez instead of burying him under regret. March 15th, 1971. Firebase Alpha. We were on a recon mission when everything went to hell in a handbasket. Enemy mortars, compromised landing zone, wounded men scattered across a jungle that was trying to kill us all. He talked about Rodriguez's cool under fire, his dedication to keeping the squad connected and coordinated even when the radio got blown to pieces. He talked about the kid's courage, his refusal to complain even when shrapnel had torn through both his legs.
When I got to him, he was hurt real bad. Real bad.
But you know what he said to me? Tommy looked around the circle. He said, "Doc, make sure the guys get out. Make sure they get home to their families." Several of the wounded warriors nodded. They understood that kind of brotherhood, that instinct to put others first, even when you're bleeding out. "So I made a choice," Tommy continued. "I sent the squad to the alternate LZ, and I stayed with Rodriguez. I stayed because he was my brother, and because nobody should die alone in a jungle 10,000 miles from home." "How long did you stay with him?" asked an older veteran, a man with burn scars covering half his face. 3 days, Tommy replied. "I held him while he died. I talked to him about Carmen, about the Yankees, about that apartment in Queens he was going to get when he rotated home. I made sure his last words were heard by someone who gave a damn about him." The circle was dead silent now. And when the recovery team found us, Rodriguez was gone, and I was barely breathing. They called me a hero for staying with him, but I never felt like a hero. I felt like a failure because I couldn't save him. The young soldier with the missing leg spoke first. "Sergeant, can I ask you something?" Tommy nodded. "If you were wounded and dying in some jungle somewhere, would you want to die alone?" "Hell no," Tommy replied immediately. "And if your medic stayed with you, held you while you died, made sure your last moments weren't filled with fear and loneliness, would you call that medic a failure?" Tommy stared at the young man, the question hitting him like a sledgehammer. No, I'd call him a brother." The veteran with the burn scars leaned forward. "Sergeant, I lost 3 of my Marines in Fallujah. IED, I was the only one who walked away. You know what I learned in therapy?" Tommy shook his head. "I learned that survivor's guilt isn't about what you did wrong. It's about loving someone so much that you'd rather carry their pain than let them carry it alone. You've been carrying Rodriguez's pain for 52 years. Don't you think it's time to let him rest in peace?" Colonel Martinez stepped into the circle. "Sergeant Brennan, these men understand something about sacrifice that most people never will. They understand that sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't trying to be a hero. Sometimes it's just refusing to let your brother die alone." She gestured toward the memorial wall. "Every name on this wall represents someone who made the ultimate sacrifice, but they also represent the people who loved them, who served with them, who held their hands when the time came. You didn't fail Rodriguez. You honored him in the best way possible." Tommy looked around the circle at faces marked by war, by loss, by the kind of understanding that only comes from shared experience. For the first time in 52 years, he was surrounded by people who knew what it meant to make impossible choices under impossible circumstances. "I've been coming here every day for 3 years, he said quietly, sleeping rough, staying close to his name. I thought if I suffered enough, if I gave up enough, maybe it would balance the scales. Maybe it would make up for not saving him. But that's not what he would have wanted," said a female veteran with prosthetic arms. "Would Rodriguez have wanted you to spend 50 years punishing yourself for staying with him?" Tommy thought about Rodriguez, really thought about him, for the first time in decades. Not the dying kid in the jungle, but the living kid who talked about baseball and wrote letters to Carmen and always shared his care packages with the squad. "No," Tommy said, tears streaming down his weathered face. He would have told me to go home, to live, to find someone like Carmen, and take her to a ball game. Then why don't you? Mitchell asked. Tommy pulled Rodriguez's dog tags from his chest and held them in his shaking hands. Because I promised I'd bring him home. I promised I'd make sure he wasn't forgotten. Colonel Martinez reached into her pocket and pulled out a small American flag. Sergeant, Rodriguez is home. He's been home for 52 years. He's right here, on this wall, surrounded by his brothers. He's not forgotten. You made damn sure of that. She pressed the flag into Tommy's free hand. But promises work both ways. If Rodriguez promised Carmen he'd come home and take her to the World Series, and he couldn't keep that promise because he died serving his country, don't you think he'd want someone to keep it for him? 3 hours later, the ceremony had ended. The delegation had departed, and Tommy sat alone on his bench with a pen and paper that Colonel Martinez had given him. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't staring at panel 10W. Instead, he was staring at a blank piece of paper, trying to find words for a letter he should have written 52 years ago. Mitchell approached quietly and sat down beside him. "Having trouble?" the young Marine asked. "I don't know what to say," Tommy replied. "How do you explain 50 years of radio silence? How do you tell someone you're sorry for disappearing without a word?" "Maybe you start with the truth," Mitchell suggested. "Maybe you tell her about her fiancé, about how brave he was, how much he loved her, how his last words were her name." Tommy began to write. "Dear Carmen, my name is Thomas Brennan. I served with your fiancé, Michael Rodriguez, in Vietnam. I should have written this letter 52 years ago, and I'm sorry I didn't. I'm sorry for a lot of things, but I'm not sorry I knew Mike. I'm not sorry I was with him when he died. And I'm not sorry that his last words were about you, about the life you were going to build together, about the promises he made that he couldn't keep." He paused, looked up at Rodriguez's name on the wall, and continued writing. "Mike died a hero, but more than that, he died loved. He died knowing that someone cared enough to stay with him, to hold his hand, to make sure he wasn't alone. I've spent 50 years thinking I failed him, but today I learned something. Maybe the greatest thing we can do for someone we love isn't saving them. Maybe it's just loving them enough to stay." 2 weeks later, Tommy received a phone call at the VA shelter in Southeast DC where he'd finally agreed to stay. The voice on the other end was older now, touched by decades and loss, but still carrying that Bronx accent he remembered from Rodriguez's stories. "Thomas, this is Carmen Rodriguez Morales. I got your letter." Tommy's hands shook as he held the phone. "Carmen, I'm so sorry. You should have nothing," she interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "You gave me the greatest gift anyone could give me. You told me that Mike didn't die alone. You told me that someone who loved him was holding his hand when he went home to God." She paused, and Tommy could hear her crying softly. "I've spent 52 years wondering if he was scared, if he was alone, if he called my name and nobody heard him. You took that pain away. You gave me peace." Tommy couldn't speak. "Thomas," Carmen continued, "I have something to tell you. Mike and I never made it to that World Series game, but I went for both of us. Every year on his birthday, I go to Yankee Stadium. I buy 2 tickets, 2 hot dogs, 2 beers. I sit in the bleachers, the cheap seats he always said were the best because that's where the real fans sat. This year, I'd like you to come with me. I think Mike would want that. I think he'd want us to keep that promise together." 6 months later, Tommy Brennan walked into Yankee Stadium wearing clean clothes, carrying a ticket to Section 203, Row 15. His hair was cut, his face was shaved, and around his neck he wore 2 sets of dog tags, his own and Rodriguez's. Carmen Rodriguez Morales was waiting for him at Gate 4, holding 2 hot dogs and smiling through tears. She was 71 years old now, a grandmother with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes. But when she saw Tommy, she saw the young medic who had loved her fiancé enough to stay with him in a jungle on the other side of the world. "Hello, Thomas," she said. "Mike would be so proud." They sat together in Section 203, Row 15, and watched the Yankees play the Red Sox. They ate hot dogs and drank beers and talked about a kid from the Bronx who had died too young, but had lived long enough to matter. And when the crowd stood for the seventh-inning stretch, when "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" echoed through the stadium, Tommy looked up at the sky and whispered, "We made it, Mike. We finally made it home." 3,000 miles away, carved in stone in the heart of the nation's capital, a name on a black granite wall seemed to shimmer in the distance. No longer an accusation, but a reminder. Some promises take a lifetime to keep, but they're always worth keeping. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, KIA 1971, was finally home. This story reminds us that heroism isn't always about the lives we save. Sometimes it's about the love we show to those we can't save. It's about staying when leaving would be easier, about carrying someone else's pain when they're too broken to carry it themselves. Tommy Brennan spent 52 years thinking he had failed his friend, but the real failure would have been letting Rodriguez die alone, forgotten, unmourned. Instead, Tommy became the keeper of a promise, the guardian of a memory, the living proof that some bonds are stronger than death itself. Today, Tommy lives in a small apartment near the memorial. He volunteers at veterans shelters, helping other soldiers find their way home from wars that ended decades ago. And every morning, he still visits Panel 10W, not as a homeless man seeking forgiveness, but as a brother keeping watch, because that's what brothers do. They stay, they remember, they keep the promises that matter most. Have you ever met someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear? Have you ever witnessed the moment when guilt transforms into grace, when pain becomes purpose? Share their story in the comments. Tell us about the hidden heroes in your life, the people who stayed when staying was. Subscribe to The Human Stories, because every name on every wall, every star in every window, every flag at every funeral represents not just loss, but love, not just sacrifice, but the people who refuse to let that sacrifice be forgotten. And remember, the greatest stories aren't always about the lives we save. Sometimes they're about the promises we keep, the vigils we maintain, the love we carry when the person we love can no longer carry it themselves. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, if you ever see someone keeping a quiet vigil, someone carrying a burden that isn't entirely their own, don't assume you know their story. Ask, listen. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is witness someone else's love.